Now let's begin. Marcus Edwards had always trusted his instincts, a trait honed over 15 years as a forensic accountant before he'd left the corporate world to teach high school mathematics. The Tuesday evening air was crisp as he pulled into his driveway, the kind of October evening that made him grateful for the life he'd built with Christine and their 8-year-old son, Dustin. He noticed Carolyn Hunter, his mother-in-law, loading black trash bags into her Mercedes SUV parked across the street. She visited often. Too often, Christine would joke, but Marcus had learned to tolerate her overbearing presence for his wife's sake. Carolyn had raised Christine alone after her father Stephen died when Christine was 12, and the bond between them was complicated, threaded with guilt and obligation. Evening, Carolyn, Marcus called out, grabbing his briefcase from the passenger seat. She startled, nearly dropping the bag she held. "Marcus, I didn't hear you drive up." "Just getting rid of some old things," she added quickly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You know how it is, spring cleaning in fall." Marcus nodded, but something in her demeanor felt off. Carolyn was normally composed, almost unnaturally so, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer clothes that seemed out of place in their modest suburban neighborhood. Today, though, her movements were jerky, rushed. As he walked past her car, he caught sight of something familiar in one of the transparent bags. Dustin's blue backpack, the one with the rocket ships that his son had been so proud of when they bought it last month. "Is that Dustin's backpack?" Marcus asked, stopping. Carolyn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, that old thing. It's falling apart. I bought him a new one." "This is just junk." Marcus felt a cold finger of unease trace down his spine. "Dustin took that backpack to your house yesterday for the sleepover. He loves that bag." "Children are fickle, Marcus. He didn't even ask about it when I dropped him off at school this morning." She moved to close the trunk, but Marcus was already reaching for the bag. "I'd like to keep it. For sentimental reasons." For a moment, Carolyn's mask slipped, and Marcus saw something he'd never noticed before, a flash of fear, quickly replaced by irritation. "Really, Marcus, it's garbage. I'm sure you have better things to do than dig through trash." But Marcus had already pulled the backpack free. It wasn't falling apart at all. In fact, it looked perfectly fine, if a bit dusty. "Thanks for thinking of him, but we'll hold on to it." Carolyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course. I should get going. Tell Christine I'll call her later." She climbed into her SUV and drove off faster than usual, her tires squealing slightly as she turned the corner. Marcus stood in the driveway, holding the backpack, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. He opened it and found Dustin's colored pencils, a few homework sheets, and tucked into the front pocket, a folded piece of paper covered in his son's careful handwriting. The note began, "What I discovered at Grandma's house is terrifying." Marcus's hands trembled as he read further. The words were rushed, some misspelled in Dustin's panic. "Dad, if you find this, I tried to tell Mom, but Grandma said she'd hurt you if I did. There are people in Grandma's basement. Old people. They look sick. She has rooms with locks and cameras. I heard one lady crying and asking to go home. Grandma saw me on the stairs and got really mad. She said if I tell anyone, bad things will happen to our family. She made me write letters that she took pictures of, letters saying I'm happy and you and Mom are mean to me. Dad, I'm scared. The people in the basement look like the missing people on the news. Please help them. Please be careful. I love you." Marcus read the note 3 times, each word burning into his brain. His son, his brave, terrified 8-year-old son, had stumbled onto something horrific and had been threatened into silence. The rational part of his mind wanted to dismiss it as a child's overactive imagination, but the details were too specific, too coherent. And Carolyn's behavior just now confirmed his worst fears. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over 911, then stopped. If he called now, what would happen? Dustin had mentioned letters, probably forged evidence against him and Christine. Carolyn was wealthy, connected, and had cultivated a reputation as a pillar of the community through her charity work with senior citizens. She served on the hospital board, organized fundraisers, and had the police chief at her annual garden party. If she'd been operating something this dark right under everyone's nose, she had contingencies. She'd already threatened his son. Marcus needed to be smart about this. He went inside and found Christine in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked up with a smile that faded when she saw his expression. "What's wrong? Where's Dustin?" In his room, doing homework. Marcus, you're scaring me. What happened? He showed her the note. Christine's face went white as she read, her hand flying to her mouth. This can't be real. My mother wouldn't. She couldn't. Chris, he wrote this. Look at the handwriting. Look at the details. But she's my mother. She runs the Silver Comfort Foundation. She helps elderly people who have no one else. Does she? Marcus asked quietly. When's the last time you actually visited one of her facilities? Seen the people she's supposedly helping? Christine sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. Oh God, what do we do? Marcus knelt beside her, taking her hands. We protect our son, and we stop her. But we have to be careful. She's already gotten to Dustin, threatened him, made him write those letters. If we go to the police now with just this note, it's a child's word against hers. She'll destroy those letters and any evidence, and then she'll come after us. So what do we do? Marcus's mind was already working, falling into the patterns he'd developed during his years investigating corporate fraud. We investigate. We gather evidence. And we take her down in a way she can't escape. Over the next 3 days, Marcus barely slept. He'd called in sick to work and spent his time digging into Carolyn Hunter's life with the methodical precision that had once made him one of the best forensic accountants in the city. What he found made his blood run cold. The Silver Comfort Foundation was registered as a nonprofit, supposedly providing in-home care and temporary housing for elderly people in crisis. Carolyn's public financial records showed modest donations and reasonable expenses. But Marcus knew how to look deeper. Using techniques he'd learned tracking money laundering operations, he found the gaps. Properties purchased through shell companies, all linked back to Carolyn through a maze of LLCs and trusts. At least 6 houses in the city, all registered to different entities, all connected to her. The foundation's client list was carefully vague. No names, no addresses for the people she claimed to help. Just aggregate numbers that looked good on paper, but meant nothing in practice. He cross-referenced missing person reports in the area. Over the past 3 years, 17 elderly individuals had been reported missing by concerned neighbors or distant relatives. All had been estranged from their families. All had some form of dementia, and all had modest savings or property. The cases had gone cold, dismissed as vulnerable people wandering off or choosing to disappear. Marcus printed everything, stored copies in 3 different locations, including a safety deposit box he opened under his mother's maiden name. He photographed the note Dustin had written and secured the original in the box as well. On the 4th day, he met with someone from his past, Phil Shannon, a former FBI agent who'd worked on several cases with Marcus during his corporate investigation days. They met at a diner 40 minutes outside the city, far from anywhere Carolyn might have eyes. Phil was in his 50s now, retired early after a bullet to the shoulder ended his field career, and he worked as a private investigator specializing in elder abuse cases. I got your email, Phil said as he slid into the booth across from Marcus. I've looked into the Silver Comfort Foundation before. Had my suspicions, but could never get anything solid. What kind of suspicions? Phil leaned forward. 3 years ago, a woman named Madeline Greer hired me. Her father, Herman Montgomery, had been living in one of Carolyn Hunter's facilities. Madeline couldn't reach him, and when she showed up, she was told he'd moved out, gone to live with a cousin in Arizona. But Herman didn't have any cousin in Arizona. He didn't have anyone except Madeline, and he had early-stage Alzheimer's. She was his power of attorney. What happened? Madeline pushed back, threatened legal action. 2 weeks later, Herman supposedly called her from a Phoenix number, telling her to leave him alone. The voice sounded like him, but Madeline swore something was off. Then she got a letter from a lawyer in Arizona saying Herman had changed his will, left everything to a caretaker who'd helped him. Madeline fought it, but the documentation was airtight. Herman's signature, notarized, the works. You think it was forged? I know it was forged, but I couldn't prove it. And then Madeline's house burned down. Electrical fire, the investigators said. She barely made it out. After that, she dropped the case, took what little insurance money she got, and moved to Canada. Marcus felt sick. Carolyn threatened her. Or worse. The thing is, Marcus, I've tracked similar patterns. Isolated elderly people, modest assets, all connected to Carolyn's network. They disappear from the system, their assets get transferred, and they're never seen again. But I could never get inside, never get proof. She's protected. The police chief, Judge Clifford Campbell, half the city council, they all support her foundation. She throws money at the right campaigns, hosts the right parties. My son found something, Marcus said quietly. He saw people in her basement. He wrote a note saying they looked like the missing people on the news. Phil's expression hardened. Jesus, Marcus. If she knows your son saw. She knows. She threatened him. Made him write letters implicating me and my wife. Probably insurance in case we talk. You need to get your family out of here. Now. Running won't save those people in her basement. And it won't stop her from coming after us eventually. Phil studied him for a long moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need to do what the law can't. I need to get inside her operation, get evidence that's so overwhelming even her friends can't protect her, and I need to do it in a way that keeps my family safe. That's not just dangerous, Marcus. That's likely illegal. Marcus met his eyes steadily. I was a forensic accountant for 15 years. I know how to make illegal things look legal, and legal things look illegal. I know how to manipulate financial records, create paper trails, make evidence appear or disappear. I just never used those skills for anything except finding the truth. But for my son, for those people suffering in her basement, I'll use every dirty trick I ever learned. Phil was quiet for a moment. I'm officially retired, so I can't be involved in any official capacity. But unofficially, I've been waiting 3 years for someone to take Carolyn Hunter down. Whatever you need, I'm in. Marcus spent the next week playing the role of the oblivious son-in-law while secretly mapping out Carolyn's entire operation. Christine struggled with the cognitive dissonance of investigating her own mother, but she'd seen the fear in Dustin's eyes when they gently asked him about his sleepover. Their son had barely been able to speak about it, shaking and crying, and that had hardened Christine's resolve. They kept Dustin away from Carolyn, making excuses about a busy schedule, a stomach bug, extra tutoring. Carolyn called repeatedly, her voice growing sharper with each conversation, but Christine held firm. Marcus discovered that Carolyn's operation was even more sophisticated than he'd initially thought. She targeted elderly people through community outreach programs, offering free health screenings and home safety assessments. She identified those who were isolated, showing early signs of dementia, and had assets worth taking. Then she moved them into her care facilities, the houses she owned through shell companies. Once inside, they were drugged, kept compliant, and systematically robbed. She forced them to sign documents transferring their property and savings. Those who resisted or were too far gone to sign anything simply disappeared. Marcus found death certificates for 4 people who'd been in Carolyn's care, all listing natural causes, all signed by the same doctor, Dominic Vincent, who served on the board of Silver Comfort Foundation and received a generous consulting fee. But the people Dustin had seen in the basement weren't in any official record. They were ghosts, people Carolyn was keeping alive for some reason Marcus hadn't yet determined. The breakthrough came when Phil hacked into Carolyn's email, not admissible in court, but useful for intelligence. They found correspondence with a man named Burt Walton, who ran a similar operation in Oregon. The emails were carefully worded but clear enough to anyone reading between the lines. Carolyn and Burt were part of a larger network, multiple people across different states running coordinated scams targeting the elderly. And there was something else, emails about new opportunities and younger prospects. They were planning to expand, to target children from foster care and broken homes, kids who wouldn't be missed. Marcus felt rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This woman had threatened his son, was already planning to expand her operation to include children like the vulnerable teenager he'd been when his own parents died, and he'd barely avoided the foster system. He formulated his plan with the cold precision of a chess master seeing 20 moves ahead. He couldn't just expose Carolyn. She had too many protections, too many people willing to look the other way. He needed to utterly destroy her, to take away every piece of protection, every ally, every avenue of escape. And he needed to do it in a way that felt like justice. The plan had 3 phases: infiltration, documentation, and annihilation. For infiltration, Marcus needed to get inside Carolyn's properties, to document what was happening to those people in the basement. For documentation, he needed evidence so overwhelming that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore it. And for annihilation, he needed to turn Carolyn's own systems against her, to make her downfall public and irreversible. Phil brought in 2 people he trusted, Lonnie Walton, a former police detective who'd been forced out for refusing to play politics, and Melody Klein, an investigative journalist who'd won awards for exposing corruption but had been blacklisted by major publications for stepping on too many powerful toes. They met in Marcus's basement, surrounded by documents, photographs, and laptops. "This is ambitious," Lonnie said, studying the plan Marcus had outlined, "and legally questionable in about 17 different ways." "I know," Marcus replied. "That's why I need people who aren't afraid to blur some lines." Melody looked up from her laptop. "I've been researching Carolyn Hunter for 2 years, ever since a source tipped me about her foundation. Every time I got close, the story got killed. My editor would get a call, suddenly there were budget concerns, or the story wasn't quite ready. Now I know why. She owns the editor. Or at least, she has enough dirt on him to keep him compliant." "Can you still publish?" Christine asked. "Not through traditional channels. But I've built relationships with independent media, bloggers, podcasters. If we get the evidence, I can make it go viral before anyone can stop it." Marcus nodded. "Phil, I need you to keep tracking Burt Walton and the others in the network. If we're taking down Carolyn, we might as well collapse the whole operation. Lonnie, I need you to identify which cops and officials are actually corrupt versus which ones are just ignorant. We'll need at least a few people in the system who'll act when we present evidence." "And you?" Lonnie asked. "I'm going inside." Christine grabbed his hand. "Marcus, no. If she finds out." "She won't. Not until it's too late." He turned to the group. "Carolyn thinks she's untouchable. She's gotten away with this for years because she's smart, careful, and protected. But she has one weakness: she's arrogant. She thinks everyone around her is too stupid or too scared to challenge her. We're going to use that." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus executed the first phase of his plan. He created a fake identity, Martin Edwards, a distant cousin dealing with the care of his aging mother. He'd used his skills to build a convincing paper trail: medical records showing early dementia, financial statements showing modest assets, even a carefully doctored social media presence. He approached Carolyn's foundation, explaining that he was overwhelmed and had heard wonderful things about their services. The intake counselor, a nervous young woman named Jamie Sampson, seemed genuinely kind, which made Marcus suspect she didn't know what was really happening. "Mrs. Hunter personally reviews all our cases," Jamie explained. "She wants to make sure we're the right fit for your mother's needs." The meeting with Carolyn was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at her main office, a beautifully renovated Victorian in the historic district. Marcus dressed down, playing the part of a struggling teacher barely keeping his head above water. Carolyn didn't recognize him at first. He'd grown a beard, wore glasses he didn't need, and hunched his shoulders to appear smaller, defeated. When recognition flickered in her eyes, Marcus saw her mask slip for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Mr. Edwards," she said smoothly. "What an interesting coincidence. I didn't realize you had family needing care." "Distant cousin," Marcus said quietly. "We reconnected recently. I know we've had our differences, Carolyn, but I've seen the work you do. Christine speaks so highly of your foundation." He could see her calculating, trying to determine if this was genuine or a trap. But her arrogance won out. The idea that Marcus, who she'd always considered weak, beneath her daughter, was coming to her for help was too appealing to resist. "Of course I'll help," she said. "Family is everything." The irony of that statement, given what she'd done to her own grandson, made Marcus want to reach across the desk and strangle her. Instead, he smiled gratefully and handed over the fabricated documents. It took 3 more meetings and countless hours of playing the desperate, ignorant relative before Carolyn agreed to take Martin's mother into one of her facilities. Marcus had actually hired an actress, Ellen Bowers, a retired theater performer Phil had worked with before, to play the role. Ellen was brilliant. She portrayed the early stages of dementia with heartbreaking accuracy, confused but still lucid enough to seem manageable. Carolyn's eyes lit up when she reviewed Ellen's financial records, the modest savings account, the small house, the life insurance policy. Not enough to attract major attention, but enough to make her worth the effort. "We have a lovely facility that would be perfect," Carolyn said. "Small, intimate, with round-the-clock care. I'll personally oversee her transition." The facility was one of the houses Marcus had identified, a 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood. Ellen moved in on a Monday, wearing a hidden camera disguised as a medical alert button and a GPS tracker sewn into her clothes. For the first week, everything seemed normal. Ellen was given a pleasant room, regular meals, kind attention from the staff, mostly young people who seemed well-meaning but carefully managed by Carolyn's enforcers. Marcus monitored everything through the camera feed, which Phil had set up to upload directly to a secure server. Then, on day 8, everything changed. Ellen was moved to a different room in the middle of the night, this one in the basement. The camera caught glimpses of other rooms, other people, exactly as Dustin had described. Elderly individuals in various states of confusion and distress, locked behind doors, monitored by cameras. Marcus watched as Carolyn herself appeared, accompanied by a large man Marcus recognized as Mike Bautista, a nurse who'd been fired from 3 different hospitals for questionable conduct. "You've been very cooperative," Carolyn told Ellen, her voice cold and businesslike. "Tomorrow, you'll sign some documents. Just formalities, transferring your assets to a trust that will ensure your long-term care. Nothing to worry about." Ellen, playing her role perfectly, seemed confused. "But my son, Martin should look at them first." Carolyn's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Martin understands. He wants what's best for you. And what's best is that you're safe here, taken care of, with no burdens or worries." The next day, they brought Ellen the documents. Marcus recorded everything as she was given sedatives, barely conscious as they guided her hand to sign papers that would empty her fake accounts and transfer her fictitious property. But Marcus had what he needed. Video evidence of Carolyn personally overseeing the drugging and coercion of a vulnerable person. It was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, the hidden camera captured horrific evidence. Elderly people being forcibly medicated, their belongings sold, their families told they'd moved away or wanted no contact. Marcus saw Dr. Dominic Vincent making his rounds, signing off on medical records that were pure fiction. He saw Carolyn meeting with Burt Walton and others, discussing their inventory and yields like these were products, not human beings. And he saw the basement where Dustin had been, the special section where Carolyn kept people who were still useful but couldn't be processed normally. People whose families were still looking for them, whose disappearances had made the news. She kept them drugged and hidden, waiting until the attention died down before making them disappear permanently. Marcus compiled everything, building a case so comprehensive that even Carolyn's protectors couldn't ignore it. But he knew evidence alone might not be enough. He needed to strip away her protection first. That's where his forensic accounting skills came in. Marcus had always been better at following money than most people realized. He'd built his career finding hidden accounts, shell companies, and creative bookkeeping that obscured the truth. Now he used those skills in reverse. He hacked into Carolyn's financial systems, not directly, which would leave traces, but through a series of proxy attacks that Phil helped orchestrate. Once inside, he didn't just copy the evidence of her crimes. He created new evidence, forged documents showing that Carolyn had been embezzling from her own foundation and paying bribes to officials. But here was the genius. He didn't make it obvious. The embezzlement was buried in realistic-looking expense reports, the bribes hidden in consulting fees and charitable donations that could be traced back to shell companies owned by Judge Campbell, Police Chief Stephen O'Brien, and City Councilor John Mooney, all people who'd protected Carolyn. Then Marcus did something even more audacious. He created evidence suggesting that Carolyn was about to flip, to turn on her protectors in exchange for a lighter sentence. Fake emails to prosecutors, draft immunity agreements, recordings of conversations that never happened but sounded entirely plausible. He leaked these manufactured documents through anonymous channels to the very people Carolyn relied on for protection. Let them think she was about to betray them. Let them turn on her before she could turn on them. The plan was risky, ethically questionable, and probably illegal. But Marcus had long since stopped caring about the rules. The rules hadn't protected those people in Carolyn's basement. The rules hadn't protected his son from being traumatized and threatened. The rules only protected people like Carolyn. So Marcus made his own rules. The dominoes began to fall on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after Ellen had been placed in Carolyn's facility. Police Chief O'Brien, convinced that Carolyn was about to implicate him in bribery, preemptively launched an investigation into the Silver Comfort Foundation, trying to distance himself from her before she could drag him down. Judge Campbell, similarly convinced of Carolyn's impending betrayal, quietly began reviewing cases involving her foundation, looking for grounds to claim he'd been misled. The city council members who'd supported her suddenly had scheduling conflicts and couldn't attend her fundraisers. Carolyn's protection evaporated overnight, and she didn't even understand why. Meanwhile, Lonnie had identified several honest cops and low-level prosecutors who'd been kept out of the loop by their corrupt superiors. Marcus, through Phil, anonymously provided them with the genuine evidence. The videos from Ellen's camera, the financial records showing the real crimes, the documented pattern of elderly people disappearing into Carolyn's care. Detective Chris Bonner, a rising star in the department who'd been quietly furious about cases being shut down for political reasons, jumped on the evidence. He got warrants, assembled a team of officers he trusted, and prepared to raid Carolyn's facilities. But Marcus wasn't done. On the night before the raids were scheduled, he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, something he knew crossed a line he could never uncross. He went to Carolyn's house. It was 2 a.m., dark and quiet. Marcus had studied her security system for weeks, knew its vulnerabilities, its blind spots. He disabled it with tools Phil had provided, tools that were definitely not legal to own. Inside, the house was exactly as Dustin had described. Elegant on the first floor, with expensive furniture and tasteful art. But the basement door was reinforced steel with 3 different locks. Marcus picked them, another skill he'd learned from Phil. The basement was climate-controlled, divided into several rooms. The first few held storage, but at the back, behind another locked door, he found them. 6 people, elderly and confused, in various states of consciousness. Some were sleeping, others staring blankly at walls. Their rooms had beds and basic furniture, but were essentially cells, monitored by cameras that fed to Carolyn's private server. Marcus recognized 3 of them from missing person reports. Herman Montgomery, Madeline Greer's father, was one of them, alive, but barely aware, drugged into docility. The others were strangers, but each had the same hollow, defeated look. He could have called the police right then, could have let the system handle it. But he'd come here for something else. He found Carolyn's private office in the corner of the basement, behind a door marked storage. Inside were filing cabinets full of documents, the real records, the ones she'd never dare keep in her official offices. Proof of every crime, every victim, every dollar stolen, and more. Communications with Burt Walton and others in the network, plans for expansion, discussions about sourcing children from foster care. Marcus photographed everything, uploaded it to the secure server. But he also took the originals. All of them. Every piece of evidence Carolyn could use to protect herself or make deals. Then he heard footsteps upstairs. Carolyn had come home early, or perhaps never left. Marcus heard her moving around, and then her voice, sharp with anger, talking on the phone. "I don't care what they think they have. My lawyers will bury this. You just need to make sure those detectives get reassigned before they can execute any warrants." She was still trying to work her connections, still convinced she could control the situation. Marcus slipped out through the basement's exterior door, relocking everything behind him. But before he left, he did one more thing. He disconnected the drug 4 lines from the 6 prisoners, carefully, making sure not to harm them. He left the basement door unlocked from the inside. And he placed an anonymous call to 911, reporting sounds of distress from Carolyn Hunter's address. Then he disappeared into the night. The raids happened at dawn, coordinated across 6 properties simultaneously. Detective Bonner led the team at Carolyn's house, where they found her in the basement, frantically trying to reconnect the 4 lines to the 6 people Marcus had freed. She was literally caught red-handed, in the act of drugging, kidnapping victims. At the other facilities, officers found more victims, more evidence. Ellen Bowers, still wearing her hidden camera, was dramatically rescued, giving a tearful interview to Melody Klein, who just happened to be there with a camera crew. The story exploded. Melody had prepared her expose perfectly, releasing it across multiple independent platforms simultaneously. Within hours, it had been shared millions of times. The videos from Ellen's camera, the financial records, the missing person cases all connected. It was overwhelming, undeniable, and most importantly, it was public before anyone could bury it. Carolyn was arrested, charged with kidnapping, fraud, elder abuse, false imprisonment, and a dozen other crimes. Dr. Dominic Vincent was arrested at his home, Mike Bautista tried to run but was caught at the airport. The nurse Jamie Sampson, who genuinely hadn't known about the crimes, cooperated fully and became a key witness. But the most satisfying part for Marcus was watching Carolyn's protectors turn on her. Police Chief O'Brien, convinced by the forged evidence that Carolyn had been planning to implicate him, publicly denounced her and launched an investigation into her foundation. Judge Campbell, similarly convinced, recused himself from any related cases and began loudly proclaiming he'd been deceived. They were covering their own asses, but they were doing it by adding to the mountain of evidence against Carolyn. And because Marcus had been so careful with his forgeries, they'd never discover that the evidence of Carolyn planning to betray them had been manufactured. The Real investigation found the real crimes, and those were more than enough. Burt Walton in Oregon, panicked by Carolyn's arrest and the evidence Marcus had provided to authorities there, tried to destroy his own operation. But Phil had already provided evidence to the FBI, who'd been building a case against the entire network. Burt was arrested mid-cover-up, which only made things worse for him. Across 4 states, the network collapsed. 19 people were arrested, 47 victims were recovered and reunited with their families or placed in legitimate care. Herman Montgomery, barely conscious after years of being drugged, was reunited with his daughter Madeleine, who flew in from Canada. Marcus watched from a distance as she sobbed over her father's hospital bed and felt something like peace settle in his chest. Christine had struggled throughout the entire process, torn between the mother she thought she knew and the monster that mother had become. When they finally watched the trial together, hearing victim after victim testify about what Carolyn had done, Christine wept for the parent she'd lost and the illusion she'd believed in. But she also grew stronger. She testified against her mother, explaining how Carolyn had threatened Dustin, how she'd manipulated her own family. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but also the most necessary. Dustin, with the help of a therapist, slowly recovered from the trauma of what he'd seen. He was proud of his father, proud that his note had helped save people. Marcus made sure to tell him every day that he was brave, that he'd done the right thing, that the adults in his life would always protect him. The trial lasted 3 months. Carolyn's expensive lawyers tried everything, claiming elder abuse by her victims, suggesting they'd stolen from her, even attempting to paint Marcus as a vigilante who'd planted evidence. But the evidence was too overwhelming. Video footage, financial records, testimony from dozens of witnesses. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. At sentencing, the judge, not Campbell, but a legitimate jurist named Krista Ortiz who'd taken over the case, looked at Carolyn with something like disgust. "Mrs. Hunter, you preyed on the most vulnerable members of our society. You stole their dignity, their autonomy, their lives. You traumatized a child, your own grandson, to protect your crimes. You corrupted institutions meant to protect people. The harm you've caused is incalculable." Judge Ortiz sentenced Carolyn to 45 years in prison without possibility of parole. At 73 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. As Carolyn was led away in handcuffs, she looked at Marcus with hatred so pure, it was almost physical. She knew. Somehow, she knew he'd been the architect of her downfall, even if she couldn't prove it. Marcus met her gaze steadily, unflinching. Let her know. Let her spend the rest of her life in a cell, knowing that the son-in-law she'd dismissed as weak had destroyed her. 6 months later, Marcus stood in his backyard, watching Dustin play with his new puppy. Christine was beside him, her hand in his, stronger than she'd been before everything fell apart. Phil had closed his investigation, satisfied that justice had been served. Lonnie had been promoted to sergeant in a department reorganization that cleaned out the corrupt elements. Melody won a Pulitzer for her Expose, which had sparked a national conversation about elder abuse and regulatory oversight of care facilities. The police investigation into Carolyn's crimes had never quite figured out how certain evidence had appeared in certain places, or how some of her protectors had been convinced she was planning to betray them. There were inconsistencies, things that didn't quite add up. Detective Bonner, who was smarter than most, had approached Marcus once, asking careful questions about his movements during the investigation. Marcus had answered truthfully. He'd been home with his family, worried about his son, dealing with the stress of his mother-in-law's arrest. Bonner had studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Funny thing," he'd said. Some of the evidence against Mrs. Hunter was almost too perfect, like someone who really understood financial crimes had put it together. But I guess that's just lucky for us, right? I guess so, Marcus had replied. Bonner had smiled slightly. Your son's a brave kid. What he did, writing that note, it saved a lot of lives. You must be proud. Every day. Sometimes, Bonner had said carefully, justice needs a little help. The system doesn't always work the way it should. People slip through cracks, get protected by wealth or connections. Sometimes, someone has to step up and make sure the right thing happens, even if the method isn't exactly by the book. Marcus had met his eyes. I wouldn't know anything about that. No, Bonner had agreed. I don't suppose you would. And that had been the end of it. Now, watching his son laugh and play, free from fear, Marcus knew he'd made the right choices. He'd crossed lines, broken laws, manipulated systems. He'd used every dark skill he'd ever learned, bent his morals, and become something other than the straightforward man he'd once been. But 47 people were alive because of it. His son was safe, and a monster was in prison. Christine squeezed his hand. Do you ever regret it? What you did? Marcus thought about that. About the forged evidence, the illegal surveillance, the manipulation. About breaking into Carolyn's house and stealing documents. About creating a web of lies that had turned her protectors against her. No, he said finally. I regret that I had to do it. I regret that the system failed so badly that someone like me had to step outside it to get justice. But the actual doing? No. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. She knows it was you, Christine said quietly. She'll never prove it, but she knows. Good. Let her know. Let her sit in that cell and know that she underestimated us. That she threatened the wrong family. Dustin ran up to them, the puppy tumbling after him. Dad, can we practice my science project? It's about forensics. Marcus laughed, scooping his son up. Absolutely, buddy. Let's solve some mysteries. As they headed inside, Marcus allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction. Carolyn Hunter had spent years building her empire of cruelty, convincing herself she was untouchable. She'd threatened his child, terrorized vulnerable people, corrupted systems meant to protect the innocent. And Marcus Edwards, the quiet math teacher and former forensic accountant she'd never taken seriously, had dismantled everything she'd built. Not through violence or chaos, but through intelligence, planning, and the willingness to fight dirty when fighting clean wouldn't work. He'd become something darker to protect the light. And he'd do it again, without hesitation, if anyone ever threatened his family. Justice, Marcus had learned, wasn't always found in courtrooms or law books. Sometimes, it was found in the calculated moves of a father who refused to let his son's bravery be in vain. Sometimes, it was found in making sure that evil people faced consequences they thought they'd always escape. Sometimes, justice looked like revenge. And Marcus was completely fine with that. The puppy barked, Dustin laughed, and Christine smiled. Life went on, normal and peaceful, built on foundations that Marcus had fought to protect. And in a prison cell across the city, Carolyn Hunter sat in her orange jumpsuit, powerless and forgotten, exactly where she deserved to be. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.